I still remember the exact feeling of that morning. Not fear, not sadness, just a heavy numbness, like my body had already accepted something my mind was still trying to deny. I was sitting on the edge of my bed, staring at the floor, realizing that almost everything I had built over the last few years was slipping through my fingers at the same time. My job was unstable. My relationship was falling apart. My savings were almost gone. And the worst part wasn't losing any of that. The worst part was realizing I had no idea who I was without it. A few years earlier, things looked completely different. I was the person people pointed to and said, "They're doing well." I had a plan. I had momentum. I had that quiet confidence that comes from believing you're moving in the right direction. I wasn't rich, but I was comfortable. I wasn't famous, but I felt respected. And somewhere along the way, I started believing that meant I was safe. Then the cracks started to appear, slowly at first, small things I ignored because they were inconvenient to acknowledge. A bad decision here, a compromise there. I told myself it was temporary, that everyone goes through rough patches. But rough patches have a way of growing when you keep pretending they're not there. The job that once excited me started draining me. I was working harder but feeling less valued. Promises were made and quietly broken. I stayed longer than I should have because I was afraid of starting over. Afraid of losing the version of myself that looked successful from the outside. At the same time, my relationship began to change. Conversations became shorter. Silence became louder. We were both tired, but instead of facing it together, we started pulling away. I remember one night sitting across from them at the table, both of us scrolling on our phones and realizing we hadn't really talked in weeks. That realization hurt more than any argument. I tried to fix everything at once. I worked longer hours. I tried to be more present. I told myself that if I just pushed harder, things would go back to how they were. But life doesn't always reward effort when it's misdirected. The day everything collapsed wasn't dramatic. No yelling, no big announcement. Just a quiet sequence of events that felt unreal as they happened. I was called into a meeting and told my position was being eliminated. I nodded like I understood, even though my mind was racing. A few days later, my relationship ended with a conversation that felt more like a mutual exhaustion than a breakup. And when I checked my bank account that same week, the number staring back at me was lower than I'd ever seen it. That's when the panic finally arrived. I started questioning everything. My choices, my abilities, my worth. I replayed old decisions in my head late at night, wondering where exactly I had gone wrong. I compared myself to people who seemed to be moving forward while I felt like I was being pushed backward. Some days I couldn't even bring myself to get dressed properly. I stayed home more than I should have, avoided calls, ignored messages. Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to explain what was happening without feeling ashamed. What surprised me most was how quiet rock bottom felt. I had always imagined it would be loud, chaotic, obvious. But instead it was subtle. A slow erosion of confidence, a constant sense of being behind. A voice in my head that kept asking, "How did you end up here?" I started applying for jobs I didn't even want, just to feel like I was doing something. Rejections came quickly, sometimes no response at all. Each one felt like confirmation of my worst thoughts about myself. There was one afternoon when I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot, staring at the steering wheel because I couldn't bring myself to go inside. I remember thinking, this wasn't supposed to be my life. That thought repeated itself over and over like a broken record. Eventually, something small shifted, not in my circumstances, but in my thinking. I realized I was spending all my energy trying to return to a version of life that no longer existed. I was grieving something I couldn't get back. And as long as I was doing that, I wasn't creating space for anything new. So I stopped trying to fix everything at once. I started with one small decision. I would take responsibility for where I was without turning it into self-hatred. That didn't magically make things better, but it changed how I showed up to each day. I stopped asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and started asking, "What can I do today, even if it's small?" Some days that meant updating my resume, other days it meant taking a long walk just to clear my head. I reached out to people I had distanced myself from, not to ask for anything, but just to reconnect. I admitted I was struggling instead of pretending I was fine. Opportunities didn't appear overnight. Progress was slow and sometimes invisible. But I began to notice subtle changes. I was sleeping better. I felt less tense. I started trusting myself again, not because I had proof things would work out, but because I was finally being honest with myself. One unexpected opportunity came from a conversation I almost didn't have. A casual mention of my situation led to a connection, which led to a temporary role. It wasn't glamorous. It didn't pay what I used to make, but it gave me structure, purpose, a reminder that I still had something to offer. That small win mattered more than I expected. It rebuilt a piece of my confidence that had been missing. From there, things slowly began to align. Not perfectly, not easily, but steadily. I learned to make decisions differently. I stopped chasing what looked impressive and started choosing what felt sustainable. I set boundaries I had never set before. I paid attention to my energy. I invested time in skills I had ignored because they didn't fit my old definition of success. There were setbacks along the way, moments where I thought I was back at the beginning. But this time, I handled them differently. I didn't panic as quickly. I didn't assume one bad moment erased all progress. Months later, I realized something had changed when I caught myself feeling calm about the future. Not excited, not overly optimistic, just calm. That feeling was new. Looking back, the period when everything fell apart was also the period when I stopped living on autopilot. Losing what I thought defined me forced me to confront who I actually was. It stripped away the layers I had built to feel secure and left me with something more honest. The life I'm building now doesn't look like the one I lost. And that's the point. It's quieter, more intentional, more aligned with who I am instead of who I thought I needed to be. At the time, it felt like everything was going wrong at once, like the universe had decided to test how much I could take. But now I can see that what I lost made room for something I couldn't have created otherwise. Not a perfect life, not an easy one, just a real one. And for the first time in a long time, that feels like enough.